Hello, Blake Brining here from Trinity Whip Company, and this is another video in this series that is titled "The Whip Maker's Eye," or how to get the whip maker's eye, or the whip making points of light and understanding, just to understand what makes a good whip or how to make a better whip for you whip makers out there, and to help out you whip crackers to understand what you are looking at as far as a whip. We're going to talk a little bit more about braiding and different ways whip makers may braid, and maybe get a little bit of pros and cons, or explain proper braiding technique. And I know that won't help you whip crackers too much, but it can kind of help you see what is going on with the whip too. Now, the two most common things people tend to braid on, especially nowadays, is an overwhelming majority that use a vise, and a lot of them use, just like a hook. I wouldn't use the hook here. I've got hooks in other places, but I'll show you on a hook in a minute. But right now with a vise, there are several ways to use a vise. And I've used to use one a lot more when I first started, I used it a lot more, and I still use them on occasion here and there. But there are different ways to use your whip in a vise. Now, I didn't want to use a whip that I'm actually making and pulling it out and putting it back in and pulling it out, or trying all these weird methods that I don't agree with an actually quality whip. So we're going to imagine this stick is the handle, this Tita cane. It's really a stock whip handle, but this is the whip that we're going to be braiding on, and just kind of give you the idea what's going on with it. Now, there are different people that would just, they may not have a metal vise. They have these plastic vices that are kind of soft, and they would just, pinch in the handle, or they would at least, hopefully, they'd put some sort of protective cloth in on it, and then they would already kind of started their braid for a bit, and however they were braiding, and then they would actually just clamp the whip itself in the vise. And the problem with that is, even if you had like a lot of wraps of towel, which is better so it doesn't push on the whip too much, you will push on that whip. But they'll already have it braided a bit, and then they'd have it locked in, and they would just keep it there, and then they would braid the rest of their whip. It's a common misconception that I've heard some amateurs say, where braiding on a vise is the only way to keep your seam straight, which is, it's an amateur phrase made by somebody that doesn't really understand the full walk of life. But I will tell you, when you're early off, it will definitely give you the illusion of a straighter braided whip, at least to an extent. Once you guys start getting farther away from that handle, all the technique of braiding that you haven't really mastered as you're still learning, it'll start to show more farther down the whip. So when you're looking at some of these whips, notice a lot of the braiding way past the handle, and that's where you'll see the braid technique really kind of take place. But for several inches on it, and it also being, in a vise, the way it is, and somebody relying on a vise, and I'm just saying those that are relying on a vise, expecting that's what will give them a straight braid, you're kind of putting your faith in a material instead of your own hands, which it really needs to be in your own hands. But with this, some of the things people do in vise when they do this method that I really don't like is that they'll braid, and then they open it up, slide it through, pinch it, and braid, and they're just always in front of their vise. And the problem with that is your seam, say it was straight, every time you slide it back, it may twist a little, and then it's locked into place again, but it's locked in, shifted. This is where you're more likely to see the seam kind of take a very shallow zigzag, which could be possible. Or this would definitely cause it more to spiral more, because the seam should always be straight no matter what. You're going to have, when you drop from a 10 to a 12 or an 8 to a 6 and different things, where, it might kind of go down a little bit as it comes back into shape, but just in that spot because you have less strands going over under on this side than this side. But it shouldn't be that much minimum. You can also kind of straighten that up most of the time, but the whole seam shouldn't be spiraling, and the whole seam shouldn't be zigzagging, which would happen if you just kept pulling this out. Other ways people use the vise, and this is probably a more preferred way to an extent, I would really say, is that they'll get a yoke, like so. They lash on their handle yoke, they have the belly braids or whatever, but they lash on their yoke, and their yoke would extend out the back of a handle. Just imagine this was a leather that was connected to the whole thing, and then they'll pinch it right there at the base. So it's kind of like pinched right there, and then that will give a little flex, which is good. It's good to have a little flex. Or they'll go farther out and pinch it, which would cause a lot of flex, which would be almost the same equivalent, on a ways to use your vise more like a hook. So, like I said, you could use a vise, and it could be just like a hook to a really huge degree, almost identical. One way I used to like to do, and I use this on bellies, not overlays, is I would like to, I used to love to, I do this on rare occasions, depending on what I'm making for different reasons, but I would wrap this cloth around this thing, and then I would put it in here and tighten it up in a way that it never really pinches the whip whatsoever. What it does is it locks this into place tight, which would be kind of like if you were to put it in a vise. And I could only use this because I used the yoke method when I used the vise. But you'd pinch this in tight, and I know it's loose because I just didn't put it in tight. But this way, it was never anything pushing in on it. And I would think if you guys really think you need this vise to help you out and not have any flex, you can do this so tight that this is a rock. But it's not pushing against your whip, which is going to cause more problems with your whip because it smashes it in. It's a vise. Even if it's not metal, it's a vise. Now, there are other ways I'm sure people come up with. I've even seen people put pieces of wood and a hook, and they use their vise just to hold their hook, you know, no problem. But we're going to travel over to a hook over here real quick, and then we'll talk more about braiding technique. Actually, is that open? So, better grab my phone to come with so I can see the camera angle. But with this, this is a keeper, and this is where I just have my falls. Hope it doesn't distract you too much, these falls. I'll just remove those. So with this on a hook, you know, it's just this one isn't one I use. This one's a little rickety. I just use it to hold my falls, but it'll work for today. With this keeper, there's a couple different ways that you would use a hook. Now with this handle, this is a stock handle, and I've got a little dent, so it'll kind of work today. But generally, you would have like a foundation of lead or something, and then that's what this keeper would hook on. But when using a leather keeper, you know, you want this to be about, you know, 9 inches long or so, give or take. So when I fold this over, pull these loops together, and then slide this through to lock it into place, it shouldn't pop up. It might, because like I said, this isn't some, you know, this is also sometimes how you might braid a handle, a half flat handle with a stock whip, but this should lock it into place. And then, yeah, it'll work. There it is. So with this is how you would braid from a hook. Now, there's other ways to use a hook. You know, even if I used a hook, I would tend to have all the strands come off a yoke, and then the yoke would just be sitting out here, you know, or actually this would be wrapped around the part of the yoke, and the yoke would just be hanging. But the yoke would eventually become the covering and the cap. And it is much better to have a yoke, I believe, than just random strands that people lash down. I usually, when I did do the random strands, I wouldn't lash strands and braid. I would have the braiding going from a yoke, and then I would pull it through until it's snugged into the braiding, and then I would get that pinched off however it was when I was braiding, so then I could lash these. But lashing these and braiding just doesn't really work, and I think it's pretty common with nylon that people do that. Not that it can't work, I'm just saying with a yoke, you can definitely pull and it will snug. You don't have to worry about pulling it out because you just put strands and lash. But anyways, it's a side note. With this, so with this hook, like I said, they could also use the yoke without a keeper, and the yoke would be here, and then they would fold it in different ways or punch holes in it and drop it on there, and that would hold it. But with a leather keeper, or even the vise, like I showed, where you know you had the leather, you know, pinched in here in the vise, so it had swivel, or you know, with the yoke, there is swivel, and so a lot of it's very intimidating for people that have never done it, and a lot of these inexperienced and, you know, new whip makers be like, I don't want to use a hook, it's too hard, I can't keep my seam straight, which it is, it's a lot harder. But the thing is, because it's hard, it requires a different skill set, and that skill set will make you a better braider than you will ever get if it's locked into place. Because when it comes to braiding technique, and I'm just going to use a random strand I had on my wall to try to talk about some braiding technique. But like I said, we're going to have this wrap around a little in a minute, and we'll talk about pulling. But when you do braid, you usually, you know, you'd have over, under, or however you needed to do over here to grab the one in the back, and then you would pull it through and bring it across. Now, first of all, say that most braiding techniques, say this is a straight line and here's a 90-degree angle, you'd always want it to be a perfect world, everything would be maybe at a 45, but there are a lot of people that like it more close to a 60 or 75 or something like that. It's not a big deal. You know, the smaller the strands, the wider it needs to be. Smaller the strands as far as smaller strands versus the fatness of the handle. But and a lot of people would say an ideal world is 45, but it can't braid 45-degree angle the whole time for different reasons, because your whip shrinks and your strands will be a certain width, and they need to kind of start to get too thick, so that's where you drop, things like that. But with this, when braiding from a stationary vise where your whip is stuck, the biggest problem and this is where you give the illusion that your braiding will be straight, is say this was a tree and I was on one side of the tree and I want to save my buddy from a ravine. He's just falling in. I'm trying to pull him out. And I can't just pull him up with my own 200 pounds. Maybe he weighs more than me. So you would have a rope, you would drop in the ravine, then you'd walk around a tree and you would anchor yourself. And then the fact that this tree is vertical and this kind of comes at a 90 and it's locked, that would allow to be a stronger rope for him to pull himself out of. And when you braid with a vise, it's going to be very similar. When you have this locked in a way that you do, come down a little bit, you have it locked in a way that you do, hold on. If it was in the vise method where there was no swivel or pull, when you would pull it, it would just go, so you're kind of like pulling around the tree. In a sense, it'd make it tight here. And I mean, don't get me wrong, it'll pull in here a little bit too, because we're talking grease strands. You know, you're not just around a dry tree with a dry rope, and it will pull through, but it's not going to pull as far up because this is stationary like the tree. You're anchoring your buddy. That's why you use a tree. You don't use like something that's angled and spiraled. You use something that has the right geometry. So with the hook, when first of all, I don't just pull at an angle. We'll talk about that in a minute. With a hook is when I pull it, as you can see, just pulling a little bit makes this want to swivel. And so this is where a lot of people that aren't used to a hook or used to vise or don't understand things are like, there's no way to keep your strand straight, or your braiding straight. Well, what makes good braiding technique is consistency. And you got to have a better technique, but having a consistent pull as far as strength on each side and angle on each side that match up with everything else as far as where you have this pulled back. Now, one of the beauties of a hook is you can have this at chest level, which is really good. Not that you couldn't do it sitting in a chair, but the thing is you want to have an anchor point from this, like archery, to your body, whatever it is. You want to constantly have that pull. Even though this will rotate, it should be in the same place. Now, as far as just a quick understanding of proper braiding technique, which we're going to get into, is when I would reach around to grab a strand, it's on a handle, it's going to be kind of hard to see. Like I said, I didn't want to use a real whip and do all this demonstrating with for different reasons, but I want to just, say I need it at a 45-degree angle, I want to just pull a 45-degree angle. I would, especially the thong, you'd see it, I would have the thong tilted and I'd at the 45-degree angle, and I'd pull back. All right, and if I needed it to be more of a wider angle, well, I might pull a little wider, or I would turn this a little more and pull it. But now this, by tilting this and pulling it, allows for less strength and a tighter pull, because you're not pulling like this where the arm is weak. I mean, who lifts weights that often and like that, even that regularly, as opposed to being able to use my body weight if I needed, if there's a certain type pull you want, to be able to just kind of pull straight back on it. You'll see pictures of David Morgan where he's pulling straight back, and if you didn't know any better, you'd think he just holds a whip and then pulls straight back. But he didn't. He'd had a little twist in there and then pull back, and that keeps the right angle you need, depending on the width of your strands and the width of the whip needed to get the right angle to snug up. And with this pulling, tilting a little and pulling back, you know, like I said, as you pull it, it does twist this, which is where a lot of people think it's going to mess up their braiding, but it does take a different skill that you'll eventually learn, and it requires consistency. But with this twist, now instead of it being more like tight right here, it'll tighten stronger farther up, producing a tighter braid throughout everything. And when I'm looking at pulling a strand and finding the right angle, well, when you do look on here, and you know, this is where gapping come in big time, is if the strands are like one of them's too small and the other one's too thick, or because I pulled it, I needed more of an wide angle, but I pulled more of a cute one when it should have been wide. That's where I don't know if it exists, but it would have landed like this, but instead it went like that, and that's where a lot of people experience gaps in the braiding. You know, again, vices will not fix poor braiding technique. You know, give the illusion of it for a while, but it's not going to fix poor braiding or poor strand prep or other issues that you have. And so when I'm, like I said, I'm constantly pulling. Another thing is when I get a new strand on top and I'm working on this and I pull it, you know, and then I whip it on top, my thumb needs to pinch and keep the pressure. Seen people talk about, well, you know, you always want to do this to keep the pressure, but pulling it will keep pressure, but they want to keep pressure here. But then they talk about if your seam's off, well, you can let go of the whole thing. And then you just slide them into place and go back, and then they'll braid a few more inches, and then they'll just let go, and they'll put both hands, like shove it back up into there, which poor technique is one reason why they're having these issues, but it's even a poorer technique to take your hands off this pressure. When you pull through and then pop it on and this replaces it, it does keep the pressure in there. And then you'd switch, pull through, bring over and switch. And I'm not really braiding, I'm just kind of showing the idea of it. But this keeps a lot of this tied up in here. Now, the thing is, when you let go of all of it, it doesn't just unravel, but it does loosen it slightly. So if I would loosen here and adjust them all, braid several inches, loosen here, this is where you might have some stiff spots and then some loose spots, or looser spots, or stiffer spots and looser spots. And that can cause because of some poor braiding, just with that technique alone. So every time you bring one through, you want to pinch it. Now, of course, every now and again, you got to take a break. And when you got to take a break, you may put around on a half hitch and just like loop it up and hold it there. But when I come back to braiding, I usually unbraid a couple inches and get it pinched where it's needed so it still maintains the tightness. And when I'm pulling through, yes, even from the side of a vise, or if this thing was stationary, not just because it's vise, but this is stationary, when you would pull this through, and you will see the strands tighten farther up. If this is a 12 plait, you'd see 6 V's on the top of V. When I pulled this next one through, you'd see it tighten up there, and you'd probably see it tighten up a little bit here to an extent. And, that's good. But like I said, when I twist this, it would tighten it even farther because it has swivel from a hook or done with the vise properly. But with this, as I pull it through and lock it, I'm really looking for, say here's the 12 strands of one, every strand was done once. I'd be looking to see this angle in here and see that when I pull through that this snugs up in the right spot. So these are some common things, like I said, about braiding and about seam. And like I said, good seam comes from even pull and braiding properly. But here's some points that'll help that out. Besides, hopefully saying you've got even pull down, or you have your technique down, whatever you do. Even though I may be tilting this when I pull, I'm not just over here, then over here, and up here, and down here. I want to have an anchor point that this is constantly pulled on. So even if I tilt like I said, it's harder to tell the stick than a thong, but even though I may tilt my hand a little bit, the pressure is coming back to the same anchor point as I pull through. And the same thing here with this hand. It's maybe twisting to get that angle. I can't really show it with the stick, but this is pulling back to the same anchor point every time. And another thing that'll cause your steam problems is every time you pull through, you guys pulling through at the same angle? I mean, not this angle. I mean like this angle. Like, is it pulling up? Is it pulling more down? Is it kind of rickety in here? Are you grabbing farther down a strand every time, and another time it's close up? Like, consistent braiding technique causes consistent braiding. And now we're gonna go outside, and it's really sunny, and it's gonna be hard to see my GoPro through my camera display, but what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna look at some whips right here, and just to get an idea to talk about, different braiding. Now this is an eBay 10-foot Zorro whip, and $80 I think, and I got it from somewhere in Europe. And buyer beware, of course, but I just wanted to check it out because I've never seen this guy's whips, and I've heard good things on different sites. And this basically how he makes his Indiana Jones, but this leather, I know it's cow, but I don't know the exact type of cow, but this thing is supposedly a 10-foot whip. I guarantee you it probably weighs 5 to 6 ounces, this whole thing. It's just probably upholstery leather wrapped up or tapered, and then just a overlay very cheaply put on. Of course, there's gaps and crazy stuff, but once again, we're going to talk about braiding seam. First of all, this has barely been cracked but 3 times, and I mean, of course, there's nothing there. Part of it's because of the cheap leather. 2, it was just braided to be a costume piece, I'm sure, not a real whip. So this is a good example of how whips shouldn't be. And, the pull wasn't really important, or the braiding technique, I'm sure, wasn't important. But like with this, the chevron, right here, so you can see it, the chevron should be with the spine, it should go straight, especially on a new whip. Now, when you get done making a whip and you roll it, a whip is it's a stick. The initial curve of keeping the seam straight with the curve would be the first time the whip maker rolls it up and gets it to where the seam all lines up and holds it there as he first curls it is what really helps keep the seam straight. Of course, having a consistent braid, though, don't get me wrong, and having a straight seam when you braid will help make that possible for a lot of good reasons and help keep it straight. It's how they originally roll this that kind of keeps this where this goes. But this one is, just all over the place. Like it's the seam is not where it should be. It's more the other seam here. And when you go around this whip, there are just so many imperfections. I mean, first of all, he does some herringbone, but then he just actually misses, and it's like does a little, I don't know what he does here. I don't think he does either, but it goes from like under 3, over 3 to whatever it is to just like an over 1, under 1, then over 3, and you know, it's really crazy. But there's tons of gaps all over this place. You know, like here's an example. You know, there's some major gapping in here. You know, like I said, it's also, this is a good example of where it's really fat, and then you just see places where it goes down really, really slim when it shouldn't. You know, but there's an example of a really exaggerated fall hitch and other things. You know, like I said, this is a costume whip, a very cheap costume whip, but this is just a big example of, you know, poor braid. The braiding is all over the place. It does, if you can see this, even though it braids and the braiding technique is not a consistent braid, it's like right here it spirals down, and now it kind of came back. Whoops. Kind of came back, but then it's back around again, and now it's almost spiraling and spiraling back and forward. It's got so many issues from just not being a consistent braid, or really this guy just probably didn't care about his braid just because, you know, this is a costume whip and you just think out there. But touching on this, one of my earlier videos, Victor Tella mentioned that, you know, that just to remind me, and I didn't mention this when I first talked about the seam being made from the guy who first makes it, but the stock whip to bull whip is a good example. And I didn't mention this in my earlier video, that it really is how, I did mention about how poor storage will cause the seam to drift off the natural curve, which doesn't really affect the whip. But the whip maker does make the original curve. So if you buy a new whip and the curve isn't lined up, which it doesn't really affect the whip to an extent, that's due to the whip maker. That has nothing to do, you know, with what you're doing with the whip at that point, although it will eventually, but it doesn't. But an example of how these are straight when they're rolled. So as you can see on a bullwhip, and a bullwhip's a little bit different, bullwhip can definitely have a strong spine because you're coming off of a solid foundation. So like I said, this should go with the natural, see if you can see this in the camera, you know, it should be straight and go with the natural curve of the whip very well. All right, but there's a spike here, so when I pull, this is where you can get what they call, it definitely has a spine to it, because even though when you roll it, it's stiff and you got to create your own angle, with a bullwhip, it really won't want to go back as much as it wants to curve forward, and that's why I call it the spine. It doesn't want to go back. You can loosen over time by cracking it with the belly down as opposed to the belly up method, or I mean the natural curve pointing down, or the natural curve pointing up. But like I said, it's how you initially roll this whip, or where you decide to roll it, that gives us an initial curl. And a stock whip is a good example. A stock whip, and I wish I had a thong that wasn't on a whip right now. But if you look at this, say this is where the spine of a bullwhip would be, the chevron should be pointing in on a bullwhip. But on a stock whip, the way the keeper is, you actually are braiding it. It braids like this. So instead of it being where it actually attaches to a keeper, you're braiding it like this, which would really be the up and down point. But once it goes on a stock whip, it's actually curved to the side. You know, and so that's very interesting. And it doesn't also have like a piece of spring steel or anything, which would help it lock down so that it might have a spine. But once again, this goes to show that the natural curve comes from the whip maker, because this would be the side of the braiding on a stock whip, or if this is a bull whip, this would be the side of the braiding. And as a bull whip, this, which would be the top, is the side on a stock whip. So a lot of that natural curve comes into place. But with this, like I've talked in other videos, there should be, these strands should match. See if I can get them in here. There should be no gaps in the braiding. Now this is a very used whip. This is the first whip I made after visiting Joe. And all these strands should be consistent. It's a very fine point on the stock whip. All right, there is no drops on this being an 8-plat, so I can't really go into detail with this. This is a very, you know, nice and small 8-plat fall hitch. It's got a little grease on it, must grease recently. And like I said, look at this. This is something good to see. Like we talked about fall hitches. This is all greasy. I don't see if I can wipe the grime away. But you should see there might be a little spiral or curve to it. It's not always going to go straight out with the way you tie your fall hitches, but they should be lined up. It shouldn't be like jagged. They can have a little spiral curve to them, but it shouldn't be jagged. Let's see if this one will show that up on a 6-plat. Like this 6-plat, see if you can see it right here. Like I said, they'll spiral up around a little, but it's not up, down, up, down, up, down, the way this works. And like I said, the way this was initially, this is a new whip of mine. This is a 6-foot fader anyways. With this target whip though, like I said, it should have this original shape, and the seam should be lined up, but that's more due to how I stored it. But it shouldn't be spiraling around. There shouldn't be a part where this thing just wants to dip in half. There shouldn't be gaps. There shouldn't be tight spot, loose spot. There's so many things you can see other whips. And now as far as whip makers that might say that you can't help but gaps, in this whip, in this whip, it starts out, this is a fader, this is a series of mine where it starts out black, and then I replace the black with natural. And if there was ever a whip to have a gap, it would be a whip that takes all the strands on one side, right, all the strands on one side, and reduces them from the black all the way to natural. All right. And I know I talked on other ones about stuff like drops, and we'll get into detail on drops. We'll get into detail on how to set the right fall to your fall hitch and everything. But I just wanted to get this video that was mainly about what I think would help you guys is understanding how to look at the braid. Once again, the initial seam on the spine is due to the whip maker curving it for the first time. And when it gets done rolling, it's usually flat. Stock whips use the side of the seam as their spine, but bull whips, because of the nail spike, it'll definitely have one part where it wants to bend more than the other. As far as the braiding technique, like I said, we talked about the difference between the vise and a hook. You can use a vise like a hook, but you can't really use a hook like a vise. There's always going to be swivel. We talked about braiding technique a little bit, how to keep that you need it consistent as far as angle and everything. There's a lot